Okay. Good evening, everybody. My name is Justin Erb, and welcome to the Chicago Neoliberals Q&A session. Thank you for joining us. This month, I am here with David Shor, the head of data science at OpenLabs R&D. David worked for the Obama campaign in 2012 and recently gained a lot of acclaim for having some of the most accurate predictions about the 2020 elections. He's joining us today to talk about how we can be more effective advocates and communicators in Illinois and Chicago politics. Welcome, David.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so the first thing I want to ask is you are a proponent of what's called the median voter theory, is that right?
Median voter theorem, yes, within reason.
Would you mind explaining that for everyone?
Well, it's a little bit like the efficient market hypothesis in that it's like clearly true in some sense. There are stronger forms which are ridiculous. But the basic, I would say the basic thesis, at least in terms of how I would restate it for the public, is that the key to winning elections is to talk about popular things that people care about using language that people can understand. In my world, as a political operative, I think that people really want to talk about other things. They like to talk about digital targeting and analytics and data science and, all of this other stuff. But the reality is that ideological positioning is actually incredibly important. And I think in some ways it is it is actually one of the only tools that we have, to win elections to an extent to which has become underrated.
So I think one of the important things for the median voter theorem then is to figure out who the median voter is and what they believe, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. And one of the challenging things about the nature of American democracy is that unfortunately the goal isn't to get 50.1%. The goal is to have control of the Senate or to win the Electoral College or win a majority of the House. And even though the mechanisms are all somewhat different, all three of those institutions and also our state legislative institutions are incredibly biased, against progressives and against Democrats. From a federal perspective, just from an electoral college perspective, Democrats need to get about 52% of the vote with our current coalition in order to win the presidency. On an ongoing basis, they need to win something like 53 to 54% of the vote in order to win the Senate. And they need to 52% is roughly the break-even point for the House. On a state legislative level, there are places like North Carolina or Wisconsin or Michigan that are so gerrymandered, even 54%, wouldn't be enough to secure a majority. And so that means that when we chase the median voter, it's not really the median voter in the country, it's the pivotal voter, and that is in the context of the Senate, someone who voted for Obama and then voted for Trump twice in Montana, which is hard.
So would that calculation of who the pivotal or marginal voter is, so that would look different in Illinois than it would for the country as a whole, or California or North Carolina or something like that, right?
Absolutely. But I think the important thing to remember, and this kind of gets to what I see as one of the biggest problems of politics, is that the median voter nationwide is about 50 years old and doesn't have a college degree. And when you take that out to a Democratic primary, a presidential primary, that which is the highest turnout of the primaries, you get the median voter is 58 years old and still doesn't have a college degree. And so once you get to local politics, I don't have the numbers offhand for Chicago, though I have I volunteered in some Chicago races in the past. It's generally it's not rare to find local elections or primaries where the median age is above 65. And there's like two parts to that. The first is among Democrats, there is we all can feel it, but the survey data shows it too. There's a strong correlation between ideology and age among Democrats, where young people are substantially more likely to identify as very liberal. And I think the other point, and the other point is that even then, there is not a single geography in this country, except for maybe some tiny college towns where a majority of the population identifies as liberal. I think the most liberal state in the country is Vermont, and there about 35% of people identify as liberal. And among people who identify as liberal, only 75% of them identify as somewhat liberal as opposed to very liberal. And so, I'm rambling a little bit, but the point is just that even in places like New York or Chicago, or even Burlington, like the reality is that these electorates are a lot more conservative than, you might think from activists on Twitter. And I think the evidence for that is that Chicago is not a social democratic paradise, and neither is New York. And frankly, neither is Vermont or Massachusetts.
Yeah, I'm happy you brought that up, because it wasn't all that long ago that we had a Republican governor and actually a Republican state house.
Republican governor, you have to go all the way back to 2019. But yeah, no, I mean, that's absolutely true. I think that one of the big category errors, that I think leftist activists make, and, just full disclosure to all of you, I identify as a socialist. But I think one of the big category errors is, that they have a theory of politics that involves being bold and being radical. And again, median voter, 50 years old, has a mortgage, he doesn't have a college degree. This is not particularly amenable to radical change. And I think the evidence there is that when you go and you look, there are Republican governors in Vermont and Maryland and Massachusetts, and there is a Democratic governor in Kansas. And the reason is that you had these Democratic and Republican governors on each side doing super unpopular, ambitious things. Sam Brownback tried to get rid of public education or slash public education. He slashed income taxes and did a bunch of public service cuts. And I think there's a nihilism in politics, but the reality is voters didn't like it and they voted for a Democrat. In the same way, in Vermont, the governor tried to pass, Shumlin tried to pass single payer healthcare. It turned out to be a fiasco. It turns out that 11% payroll tax increases are not popular even in Vermont. And the end result is there's a Republican governor. In Maryland, it was a road tax, which should be a lesson to all the neoliberals here as well, But it just, goes to show, if there was an appetite for social democracy, then rain tax, you're right. It's asphalt tax. I appreciate it. But if there was this groundswell for social democracy, then we would see it in places like New York or Chicago. And Chicago mayoral, it was a bit ago, but in New York, Andrew Yang is poised to win, despite probably being the single most moderate person in the field. So it just kind of goes to show there's the electorate's more moderate than folks think, and that includes Democrats.
Okay. Yeah, I think it is interesting. I don't know if you've read this Ezra Klein article in the New York Times, where he talks about his disappointment with California as a state, where he's frustrated at the country as a whole, because, as you mentioned before, Democrats need to do substantially better than Republicans in order to pass legislation. And in California, that's not necessarily the case, where if you're a Democrat in California, you probably don't have that difficult of a time being elected, and yet you don't see these progressive outcomes. So you reasoned that it's probably that there just isn't necessarily an appetite for a strong social democratic state in Illinois, or really necessarily anywhere in America. But what can more left of center people do to convince people to get there and to pass the progressive legislation that they want to see?
Yeah, I think that, and I'm going to make some boring points that are a lot outside my area of expertise, but as Matthew Iglesias says, I think that it is a real problem that the most liberal places in the country are not affordable places to live. I think that there's, I agree with, I guess, the neoliberal diagnosis of the problem, that in practice, blue areas, in contrast to red parts of the country, strongly limit development. This drives up cost of, this drives up, housing prices and cost of living. And then this creates a bunch of downscale attendant problems. And that's all bad. I think there's also some other, fundamental issues just in terms of, I guess I'll just to start over. I think that the problems in blue states are actually very similar to the problems in red states. Well, in the country overall, where if you look at really polling here and also in Europe, I think there are some universal rules of politics. You should do popular things and you should not do unpopular things. And so the question is, what's popular and what's unpopular? And it's a harder question than it should be, because the reality is that most people who fund issue research in this country are issue advocacy groups, and so as a result, and I see it on a day-to-day basis. As a result, most issue polling, or a very large fraction of issue polling, is like literally propaganda. I know I sound like a crazy person when I say that, but like I work in democratic politics. I worked as a pollster for a while. It's literally true. And the other piece is the issue polling that isn't done by self-interested issue advocacy groups is done by academics who usually are pretty liberal. And so, that's how you get these big statistical MRP experiments that model climate support across the country and say that 60% of people in Washington want a carbon tax, and then it gets onto the ballot and it gets 42% twice, or I remember the exact number. So it is hard to know, what's popular and what's not. I think, there are, and I think that something that is really, that I've kind of come to learn is when I first started working in politics in 2012, I was 20 years old, and there were all these older people, who had been in politics for a really long time. And, I remember hating them, or really resenting them. I was just like, oh, these pointy headed bosses, they don't know anything about math. They're just going off of their gut. But, when I look back, I think that about 80% of the time, where we disagreed, I think that they were right, big picture. And, the story, I think, for why, is this story that, in fact, it just used to be, it's not that older people have wisdom, it's that there used to be more swing voters. It used to be easier to learn what was persuasive and what's not. And now it's like a hard technical problem. And so that's a roundabout way of saying that I think that the instincts of politicians, especially older politicians, about what's popular and what's not popular are right. That large scale middle class tax increases are super unpopular, that the country is culturally conservative, on a lot of cultural issues, that broadly speaking, people, and this is true here, it's true in everywhere else in the world, people trust the center right on matters of the economy, on immigration, and on crime, while they trust the center left on, healthcare and education, and the environment. And so the challenge is, how can you achieve, policy progress without large scale tax increases that will, and create this backlash against you. And, I'm not a policy person. I read policy Twitter like everyone else, but it's not my expertise. But I think that it pushes you to an almost un-neoliberal place, that there are a lot of policies that would traditionally be considered neoliberal, things like carbon taxation, that are super unpopular and so just shouldn't be done. Regulatory mandates, which, to be clear, also not super popular. I mean, there's it's more popular than carbon taxes, but people have some weird identity politics around internal combustion cars. But it means, for example, that supporting clean energy R&D, because that has a multiplier. Or it means, I think that being clever with program design and thinking about things in terms of, given that there are hard caps on how much tax revenue you could raise, it's very, very difficult. And you can see this on a state level, where there it's even harder because there's tax competition. There clearly isn't, given the tax competition, there clearly isn't a ton of room, to raise income, non taxes on the rich that much higher than they are in blue states. Though, in Illinois, there totally is, but we just tried to do that. So given that, really just trying to rank order things, this is something I like to think about in terms of how much do you reduce poverty, or how much do you reduce inequality, per dollar of tax revenue raised. Minimum wages score really well on that because they don't involve any tax increases at all. You know, I've personally been a fan of active labor market policies because, you know, if you reduce unemployment, there's like a pretty plausible econometric case that like raises real wage growth for people who aren't recipients of your program. And then, you know, I think it, you know, pushes you toward some corporate you know, kind of inefficient corporate regulations. And then I think it also pushes you toward, let's do a lot of accounting gimmicks to try to raise more revenue. I think it's one of the strongest arguments for, like, you know, Medicare for America versus Medicare for all. Premiums are an accounting gimmick. You know, there's accounting gimmicks around changing the Social Security Trust Fund to include equities. But like, you know, I'm not, you know, the best person to educate all of that stuff, but I think my big point, then I'll shut up, is just that all of these accounting gimmicks are important because, you know, this restraint, this policy restraint around taxes is very real, and the risk of tax backlash is very real. We've really seen it. We've seen it across the country again and again.
Yeah, just quick 2 points. One, no one's here to listen to me talk. We're here to listen to you, so please ramble away. And then my second point is you brought up briefly the tax referendum that we had in Illinois. For people who aren't familiar, Illinois has a flat tax or flat income tax. And in 2020, there was a referendum to change it to a progressive income tax. And it, at least surprisingly to me, it failed. So I was wondering if you've followed that closely at all. And if so, do you think there was anything that they could have done to have passed it, or is it just not viable right now?
I'm trying to remember the exact margin. Did it get 45 or 47 or?
I don't remember offhand. If anybody in the chat can do a link.
Yeah. So, you know, I didn't work directly on that campaign, though. You know, when one of my friends at Civis was on it, I'm sure there were, you know, some messaging missteps that you can point to, and I'm sure there are counterfactual worlds where we end up winning that race. Oh, cool, 46. That was one of my 2 guesses. So, you know, I mean, but I think the key lesson here is, even if it was 51, you know, Illinois is a very blue state. And I think you have to look at that ballot measure in the context of all of the other, you know, ballot measures that happened across the country, where there were tons of tax increases to fund schools that failed. You know, Uber's ballot measure on ride sharing succeeded. You know, I mean, it's crazy. They made billions of dollars off of in their share price off of I think like a $20-30 million investment. And you know, I think it gets to this real point that I think that leftists don't want to confront, or other leftists don't want to confront, which is, you know, I think that there's this question of, why is the US so conservative? And I think a really natural answer that that leftists like to come to is this idea that it's because of the corruption of individual people in the Democratic Party. That, like, Joe Biden, if he wanted to achieve social democracy, he would do it. Or if he, you know, sometimes you hear that they just don't want to win enough, or, you know, whatever. Or there's this assumption that Democrats are making basic tactical mistakes or strategic mistakes. And to be clear, I mean, there are tons of them, though. My sense is that if I don't know, leftists were in charge of everything, there would probably be more mistakes. But the real answer is that business has a lot of cultural power. And, you know, I think the old school leftists might have read their Gramsci, that basically, you know, like, one example I like to give is like Heidi Heitkamp when she was senator. You know, she voted to deregulate the banks, probably multiple times, but at least once. And I'm sure that if you had polled, you know, do you think banks should be deregulated? It probably wouldn't have polled well, even in North Dakota, probably. I don't know. So the question is, like, why did she do that? And, you know, I think one answer is to say, oh, you know, she's corrupt. It's not true. Yeah, she literally didn't cash out after, but like, it's not, I don't know, it's not really that. You know, the real issue is that even though banking regulation is unpopular, being broadly supported by the chamber, having the Chamber of Commerce's endorsement, or having a broad sense in the business community that Heidi Heitkamp is on your side, that's super valuable. And the reason it's super valuable is that people actually trust corporations and people actually trust businessmen. at least as much, if not more than government, definitely more than labor unions. And so that just kind of sucks. I mean, I talked a little bit about trust, how people trust, the left on kind of these issues that relate to fairness, and they trust the right on issues that relate to order. And part of that is they trust the right on taxes. There's like this idea that, conservatives are, like liberals mean well, and they want to make people better, but they're also like naive and don't understand the way the world works. And conservatives, can be a little heartless, but, they're like stern and efficient, and they'll like do what needs to be done. And, that I think it just kind of goes to show that, the public does trust, like whenever there's a public dispute, even in the bluest parts of the country, we lose really basic fights, like should there be progressive taxes against the business lobby? And to be clear, the fair tax campaign, if I remember correctly, like considerably outspent their opponents, and still lost. So it's not a naive money in politics story. And so that's just, it's a real restraint, on center left politics, which sucks.
So one thing I want to ask is, there's obviously a lot of places to gain where you find out where the median voter is and then pitch policies that are attractive to them. But is there a role, or I guess, is it the activist role to try to move where the median voter is? And if not, is there anybody that can do that?
Yeah, it's hard to talk about this because activism can mean a lot of different things. There are a lot of, and I think some of them are productive and some of them aren't. So I think it's helpful to just kind of be more exact in terms of mechanisms of change. My personal position, which I think is supported by evidence, is that partisan politicians do not really have the ability to change public opinion on issues. Or I'll be more precise. They don't have the ability to change swing voters' perceptions on issues. And that clarification is really important, because there's kind of two separate things. Like basically the way I like to say this in prose is that swing voters don't trust either party, but do actually have real opinions on issues. David Brockman had a great paper on this. Basically, it's like the moderates aren't moderate paper. I don't know if folks have heard of it. And so one aspect of it was really, really well publicized, which was moderates, self-reported moderates, aren't like David Brooks. They're not like, I want everything to be in the center. I'm just a moderate on everything. They actually just have wildly divergent views. Some of them want universal health care, and they also want, immigration, to be banned, and vice versa. And so there's just wild variance, and it just kind of cancels out. And so that part was really widely reported, that like true moderates don't exist. But I think then a lot of people go, okay, cool. So these people are just kind of answering randomly. But then we get to the really cool part of the paper. So what they did was funny. So what they did was they looked at, they basically did a bunch of hypothetical candidate conjoints, where they were like, would you vote for this candidate who's running on this versus this candidate who's running on this? And they kind of tested two alternative theories of voting. One theory was like this ideological theory. So you take all their positions, you put them on an ideological scale, you put the candidates, you put them on an ideological scale, and you see which one is closer to them ideologically. And then the other was issue congruence, which is basically they'll pick the candidate who agrees with them the most on issues. And I think the really interesting part of this paper was that issue congruence worked a lot better. And that's really meaningful. It means that people's issue preferences are real. It means that like every time that there are all these voters who agree with you on some things and disagree on other things. And whenever you open your mouth, you win some of them and lose some of them. So that's swing voters. But this is where we get to the piece, is that most voters aren't swing voters. We're talking something like maybe charitably 10%, probably 5% of the population. Like every single presidential election in this country in the past, since 2000, has been in a 2% range. So like clearly not that many. And so everyone else follows, don't actually have super strong opinions on policy, or they think they do, but in practice, they actually take their cues from party elites. And there's like, lots of fun polling examples you can find about this, where like, you know, Donald Trump changes his mind about something and suddenly all the Republicans change their mind and Republicans become pro-bleach. But also in the same way, you know, under Bush, Democrats were anti-trade, and then Obama endorsed TPP, and then a bunch of Democrats became pro-trade. And you know, in the same way, defund the police went from being like probably a 10% issue to being like maybe like a 30% issue. And so, you know, it's a really tempting thing when you're an activist. If you get the people in your party to embrace an unpopular idea, you can get it to go from 10% to 30%. But the problem, because again, swing voters pick their parties based on issues, and you know, hard partisans pick their issues based on party, you lose voters in the process. And there's a lot of evidence for this, and a lot of experimental evidence for this. When a party endorses an unpopular position, they lose people who supported that. And so when you have an unpopular policy, more people oppose it than support, so you lose support. And so, you know, I guess my claim on activism is that I think that because of this, the goal of getting your party to embrace an unpopular position is bad. It doesn't, because in order for the reality is we live in a democracy. And in order for a policy to be supported, you know, just given the nature of our counter-majoritarian system of government, an issue needs to get to 55, 60% support before it starts to get passed. That's when gay marriage happened. You know, everyone talks about the courts, but the courts waited until public opinion reached that point. It's starting to happen with marijuana legalization. And there's a lot of other examples too. Like, things need to get pretty popular before they have a chance of happening. And in order for that to happen, you need to persuade swing voters to your side. And the problem with swing voters is that swing voters don't agree, you know, don't trust liberal politicians. If they did, they would be liberals. We wouldn't have a problem. And the whole point, the whole reason why they're swing voters is they don't have that trust. And so I think it's actually counterproductive. You know, it's a prematurely polarizing issue, even if it looks like it could make some short-term gains. You know, if you look at polling for gay marriage over time, for example, you know, it was increasing at this nice, steady, linear clip starting in 1993, and 1992, and I'll get to that. I'll get to that year later. It starts increasing at a linear clip. 2003, you know, Gavin Newsom does all the illegal gay marriages, and suddenly it becomes a big culture war issue, and then support drops ahead of the 2004 election. And then after the 2004 election, it becomes a little less salient. People start talking about other things, and you know, it just kind of returns to that linear clip. So I think, you know, a lot of people look at that whole episode of us prematurely raising the salience as an act of bravery. But I think if you look at the polling, it's clear that actually it kind of set back, you know, the point where it would have been popular probably by a couple of years, you know, which is bad. And so the question then is, okay, so don't get Democratic politicians to embrace unpopular things. So all it does is it makes us lose elections, and actually it probably lowers support, you know, lowers support for the policy, you know, or at least among swing voters. So then is the answer just, so what do you do? Is it impossible to change public opinion? And so the first thing is I'll say that public opinion on attitudes, on issues, is much more stable than people think. Like, whenever I say people should run on popular stuff, I get all these people who say, oh, you know, you're assuming the American electorate is fixed and that, you know, you can't change people's values. And while people's values do change, in the context of a 2-year period, yes, opinions are fixed. Like, the most rapid public opinion change, and I'll actually, just to answer the generational replacement, no, the answer to that is no. It's an interesting question, but attitudinal shift, even with stuff like gay marriage, is actually a much bigger deal. And I'll talk about that in a sec for how you do it. Like, issue changes are for high salience things that people care about are very slow and gradual. Even gay marriage, which was literally the fastest, marijuana legalization is in this category too, you know, went from something like, you know, 30% to 60% over a period of 20 years. You know, in the context of a single election cycle, it is not actually possible to change the public's views on issues dramatically to the scale that you need to make the difference that you need. And so this isn't a politician's fight. You need a cultural fight. And so now I just want to get back to, you know, the early 90s. Like, if you just look at the GSS attitudes toward homosexuality, you know, it's crazy. It's like pretty flat through the 70s, through the early 90s. And then it just starts that linear trend up, and the kink in the graph is super clear. And if anyone, I don't name these things, but if anyone wants to check this in the GSS themselves, just search homosex, that's the code. If you search homosex on Twitter for Xenocrypt, Xenocrypt site, who's a good friend of mine, he has some excellent graphs on this, and he's done a lot of analysis on public opinion change that I think is very underrated. You just, you see this thing, and so what happened in the early 90s? And like the same year that this kink happened, and I wish it was like 93 or 94, one of them, it was when the AP published their first basically LGBT issues column. And so basically what happened, remember back then in the 90s, people actually read newspapers, is suddenly newspapers around the country started just telling sympathetic stories about LGBT individuals. And that, that's an anecdote, but people have done to the extent to which you can ascertain causality with time series. People have looked and basically showed that around this time, newspapers started having much more favorable coverage toward gay individuals, and then that translated, to much more favorable opinions in the public. Now, obviously, newspapers aren't real anymore, but long-term opinion change comes through culture, and you need that culture to be divorced from a political context in order for it to have an effect on swing voters. And the second point, last point I'll make there, so I'm rambling for a while, is that it's increasingly hard, and this is something I worry about, for activists to distance, in order for activists to be effective, they really need to distance themselves, from partisan politics. And I think one of the biggest trends of the last 20 years, and I think people don't realize this is now it's so natural, we can't imagine a world without it. But issue advocacy groups have become increasingly tied with one party or the other. As recently as, if I remember correctly, as recently as 10 years ago, LGBT groups would routinely endorse Republicans. Pro-life groups would endorse Democrats, and that's gone now. And what that means now is that liberal activists kind of share the same brand as the Democratic Party. I think there's some positive sides to this, in that these issue advocacy groups are much more powerful than they were 20 years ago. I think Emily's List has a lot more power in the White House than they did under the Clinton White House in the 90s. So does NextGen or whatever. But that power comes with a responsibility, because it's no longer possible for Democrats to distance themselves. And so what everyone likes to say is, they like to say, oh, let the activists be activists and let the politicians be politicians. But the activists are now financially and organizationally entangled with the politicians in a very deep way. And I think voters aren't dumb. Voters realize correctly that it is the same group of people with the same ideological and partisan goals. And so I think that it's that combined with the increasing polarization in our races just shows how it just doesn't work.
One thing I want to ask about, and then I'll open it up for just general questions from everybody here, is you pushed back a lot leading up to the 2020 election on this idea that it's going to be a high turnout election, therefore Democrats are going to do better because high turnout equals better Democratic performance. So that was kind of a myth that was deflated last year. In Chicago, we have very low turnout elections. This is, I don't think it's a conspiracy to say this was done intentionally. Our mayoral elections and alderman elections take place on off years in February, not the greatest climate to get people waiting outside. I just looked it up. The last turnout was 32%, which is a record low. So I was curious if you had any thoughts on, is there a difference between being either a politician or being an activist in a low turnout environment than a high turnout environment?
Absolutely. Generally the lower turnout an election is, the higher the treatment effects are, both in terms of persuasion, in terms of getting out to vote. The less partisan a race is, and that's true basically, all Chicago races are nonpartisan now. As just a random aside, when Harold Washington was up first time, turnout in the mayoral was, if I remember correctly, like 85% or something ridiculous, and he only got 51% of the vote against the Republicans. So really kind of crazy. I need to read a book about that. But obviously now turnout is much lower. So I think it's definitely it's the good news is that there are way more swing voters in primaries and nonpartisan races than there are in general elections. But I think the real story, and this is what I mentioned before, is that as turnout decreases in an election, that has the main implication of that is that your electorates are going to get older because older people vote more than young people. And so the lower turnout your election is, the older the people who vote in your election is. I remember there was like one local election in North Miami that I looked at once where the median age was like 76. I don't think Chicago's that bad, but if the electorate is older, that has a bunch of implications. It makes building a coalition around the interests of renters harder. It makes the electorate much more moderate because, again, within the among the Democratic primary electorate, there's a strong correlation between age and ideology. Yeah, I mean, I'd say those are the big things. And if you look basically at every progressive candidate, their base has always been younger voters. It's true for Sanders. It was true for Chewy, which was a race that I worked on. It was true for Kim Foxx. And so I guess the other thing I would say is, in contrast to national elections to some extent, like, I think I'm not going to claim that race or gender of a candidate don't matter in a national context. It's like a complicated question, but they matter definitely a lot less than in a primary. And so in a primary, if you want to succeed in a place like Chicago, taking representation seriously is just essential. Like I kind of, it's crazy to me that that progressives in New York decided to run a white person against Andrew Cuomo 2 times in a row. It's wild. And so I think if you look at Chicago politics, there are similar dynamics at play.
One quick thing is you also talked a lot coming into the 2020 election about the idea of a low trust voter who, obviously doesn't. Well, to people unfamiliar, the idea was that, tell me if I'm getting this wrong, that there's a group of voters who don't respond to polls that have kind of gotten behind Donald Trump. So that explains sort of the reason why the polls were a lot more bullish on Joe Biden, or on Joe Biden, than the election ended up being. So I'm curious how those people tend to turn out in local elections, or if they just don't exist there.
Well, the thing to remember is that only if you ask people, do you think people can be trusted, or do you think people should keep to themselves? Only 30% of people say that people can be trusted. Now, to be clear, high trusting, younger people are less trusting. Educated people are more trusting. So, a low turnout election is more trusting than the overall, electorate. But I think that, progressive activists, people who like work in progressive politics and just like and campaigns and throw themselves, into electoral organizing or organizing of any kind, they're some of the nicest people in the world. That's been my experience, and that's really weird. Most people aren't like that. One story I like to tell is, in the Obama campaign, they did a survey. I think it was Eitan Hirsch, who actually also just did a study on anti-Semitism. He did a survey of Obama campaign employees and also a survey of undecided voters. And what he found was that about a third of people who worked on the Obama campaign said that income inequality was the biggest motivating factor for them. And was for me too. That's why I do this. I think child poverty is bad. I'll stand by that statement. But less than 1% of voters listed inequality as their top concern. And so I think it just kind of goes to show that there's this strain of egalitarianism. There's this strain of of trust, you know, as a catch-all term, that's really prevalent among people who are highly engaged in the political process on our side. But most voters aren't like that. And that actually, I'll segue to a slightly related point, which is I think that our view of who voters are is a little bit skewed, because there's kind of two big factors that drive how much you vote. One is your interest in politics. That's, you know, we know. And the other is underrated, is how conscientious you are. You know, just like if you look, there's like if you join credit history, unsurprisingly, people who vote more pay their bills on time more often. You know, they're less likely to get divorced. You know, just all kinds of stuff like that. And so, among people who follow politics, especially liberal politics, because you know openness to new experiences is anti-correlated, you know, with conscientiousness. You know, we're all not super conscientious people. Maybe we're average or maybe a little bit below average, but we're like really unusually into politics. And so that's how we think of voters, people who vote. But actually most people aren't, most people who vote aren't like that. They're just like really conscientious people. They're like old. They like wake up in the morning and sort their mail and then they go and they vote. And that they're actually much less, you know, they don't into politics. They don't share the same kind of values. And that's like an important thing to keep in mind. And you know, trust is part of that. It's one example.
Okay, and with that, let's get into the general questions from people here. I have a question from Rohit that says, Asian and Latino voters seem to be moving rightward. What do you think needs to be updated in Democratic rhetoric to bring them back left?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, I think that one of the surprising things I think of the Trump era is that we've presided over a period of racial depolarization. You know, since 2012, white people have become about 4% more Democratic, and non-white people have become about 4% more Republican. And you know, this has happened. You know, this happened at every step. This has been a gradual process where it happened in 2016. You know, in 2018, there were also large swings among non-white voters in relative terms. If Stacey Abrams had done as well with Black voters as Hillary Clinton did, she would be governor right now. We would have another Senate seat in Florida. So these are real problems. But in 2016, you know, there was a roughly 9% decline in support in percentage points. So that's 19 points in margin among Hispanic voters, in a way that was, you know, I mean, particularly bad in South Texas and South Florida and Florida in general, but all just generally was really quite bad, basically everywhere in the country. And, you know, for Asian voters, it's harder to know. It is still not precinct results everywhere. There are fewer Asians, but from what we can tell, it's probably that there was a decline of something like 5 points, and you know, with larger in Vietnamese neighborhoods, and so it's easy to point to particular things. You know, we did some analysis that, you know, one of the biggest predictors of switching from Clinton to Trump was attitudes toward policing and crime. But, you know, I don't want to single out a monocausal story here because this has been a steady process. There was a decline in 2018, and there's also a decline in 2020. And so I think, you know, the bigger story is the story of ideological polarization. Basically, you know, what's interesting is that even though partisanship varies quite a bit by race, ideology doesn't, which I think is one of the most striking facts in politics. Roughly the same percentage of Black, white, and Hispanic voters identify as liberal, moderate, and conservative. But the thing is that among white people, we get about 80% of white conservatives we get about 90% of white liberals, and Republicans get about 80% of white conservatives. But among non-whites, the way to make this math work is that historically we've won non-white conservative voters by very large margins. And if you look at the public polling data, we went from winning Hispanic conservatives by double digits in 2016 to losing Hispanic conservatives by double digits. And so I think that this ideological polarization story is at the root of what's happening, that as the Democratic Party has become more educated. You know, educated people have a lot of privilege. You know, they have, they donate more, they work in staff campaigns more and all these other things. And so as white, hyper-educated liberals have kind of increased in their share, you know, of the party, they've disproportionately increased in their share of brand. And like the Democratic Party as a result has like really rebranded itself in the image of like these, you know, highly liberal, highly educated young people. And, you know, that's pushed away non-college whites, but it's also pushed away non-whites who culturally have more in common, you know, with working class white people in a lot of ways than highly educated liberals. And so, you know, I think if we want to reverse this, there's like little things like saying that you want to defund the police system, sure. But I think the big thing is just, you know, increasing the voice of working class people in the Democratic Party and decreasing, you know, the political power, you know, of highly liberal people. Again, as I said in the beginning of this talk, ideological positioning. It not only matters, it's the only thing that matters.
Yeah. This one is from Mark. He just says, I would love to hear you talk more about your thoughts on Andrew Yang.
Yeah, I mean, I do like him. What I would say about Andrew Yang is I think that Andrew Yang proves, I think, the Buttigieg theory of politics, or the Liz Smith theory of politics, which is like, when I first moved to New York 2 years ago, you know, I'd like go to like I hang out with Sean McAway at Data for Progress, and he'd always like talk about who's the transit union endorsing, or who's the borough president, you know, whatever. And there's like this theory of politics, and you saw this in the presidential campaign too, that like the opinions of professional activist groups are incredibly important. And so it makes sense to adopt unpopular positions, even unpopular positions that are not held by the majority, you know, that are not even ones that Democratic primary voters don't agree with, because if you chase these activist voters, they'll talk about you on Twitter, and that'll generate the buzz for your campaign, and then the rest of the voters would, you know, would follow. And so I think that Pete Buttigieg proved in a lot of ways that this wasn't true. You know, all these other candidates, they went, they fought, and Joe Biden too, for the record. But I think Pete Buttigieg in particular, because like Joe Biden, former vice president, winning Democratic primary, I don't know, it's not like a shocker. Pete Buttigieg almost winning Iowa, that's crazy. That shouldn't have happened. Clearly he did something right. And the thing he did right was that he just took every single media interview. He didn't care about field. But what he did was he raised a bunch of money because he was on TV all the time. Like I have a friend who is a TV booker, and you know, he was saying, oh, you know, I called Warren every single week and she refused to go on TV, but Pete Buttigieg called me every day trying to get on TV. And as a result, he got on TV. And then he took the money that he raised and he spent it on TV ads, and he won Iowa. And if things had been 2% different in New Hampshire, he would have had a decent shot of being president. And so I think that just shows the strength of that strategy, that and then somewhere in the middle, he was the only person other than Joe Biden who was willing to say, I don't support Medicare for all, and do the popular thing. And so I think that shows the power of communication and the power of doing popular things. And I think Andrew Yang is just a continuation of that Andrew Yang, he was on TV, he was on CNN all the time. People saw his face, and it turns out that's enough to crush everyone else in the race. I mean, I don't know, there's still a lot of uncertainty in these things. He still might lose, but I think he's clearly outperforming what you would expect from like some random guy on Reddit. And I think the reason is, one, that he got a lot of name recognition via mass media in a non-ideological context, and two, he's refrained from he's just kind of adopted the median voters' view on a bunch of different things. And so I just, you know, that's what I think is interesting about his candidacy, is the theory of politics that him winning would represent.
Okay. This one's from Trevor. He wants to know, we talked earlier a little bit about low social trust voters. He wants to know, what is the state of the art in dealing with these voters in polling?
Yeah, the answer is that polling is pretty broken. You know, I don't think there are really any public pollsters that have made the changes you know, necessary to adapt to the challenges that we have. The basic issue here is that response rates used to be very high. They were 12% in 2012 on phones, and phone response rates went down to 1% in 2016. So the people who are answering these surveys are incredibly weird. And what that ends up meaning is that the answering a survey becomes an act of political expression. Roughly 93% of people who answer phone surveys vote. Even if you ask them, how likely are you to vote? And they say they definitely won't vote, 70% of those people vote. It's crazy. It's not. And so, the whole thing with polling, and this is the direction the industry has to go, is that polling is based fundamentally on this idea that people who answer surveys are the same as people who don't answer surveys once you control for the things you wait on. And that's called an exchangeability assumption. And the problem is that traditionally pollsters would just look at age and race and gender and education, and that's just no longer enough. Survey takers are too weird, and it's no longer enough to generate accurate answers. And we've seen pollsters make the same error now in 2016, in 2018, in 2020. If you look at state error and all three of these years, they're highly correlated with each other. And so there's no, and so the solution, because there is no way to get an unbiased sample of people, is you have to control for more things. And within even though I'm not going to claim that people in the democratic data world have figured everything out, the direction in democratic politics, there's been very expensive collection of extensive first party data, having a voter file, having things like party registration. There's lots of things that we need to move into a world that involves lots of expensive first party data and lots of machine learning, and that public pollsters haven't done that because their business model doesn't allow it. The way that the business model of public polling was that you have like a political science grad student and some underpaid interns, and they just go and they call some people and they run something in SPSS, and that really fundamentally doesn't work anymore. And I think that's starting to be clear. It'll be interesting. I think the closest we've seen is I think YouGov actually does do the kind of pretty sophisticated modeling that you would need. I think they probably haven't gone far enough. I think that's the polling shop I think is most interesting in terms of public polling.
Okay. This one is from Stephen. He wants to know, do you think the recent research about how race-based messaging isn't as effective as class-based messaging has any lessons for deep blue cities like San Francisco?
Yeah, I think, and I've, privately, I've done, similar things to what Kala did, and I've seen pretty similar results. He's getting a lot of heat for it right now, which I'm sorry to see. But I think that I think that the important thing here is people like to posit this trade-off between being inclusive to people of color versus persuading people. And what I've seen in my research again and again is that if you actually poll people of color and ask them what issues they find most important, they have much more similar issue priorities to white moderates than to very liberal white people, substantially more. And I hope to release some public data on this soon. And what we've really seen is, as a result, because of this ideological similarity, the messages that do the best job at persuading white moderates tend to also be the messages that work best at persuading people of color and mobilizing people of color to vote. I think this is like the biggest problem we have in democratic politics, which is that the people who work in democratic politics are highly ideological, very liberal, very young. My favorite statistic is that less than 5% of the population are white people with a college degree under the age of 35. Less than 5% of the electorate, but that group is probably nearly a majority of people who professionally work in democratic politics. And it's very different. They have very different beliefs and very different values and very different priorities than obviously the people we need to persuade. And I talk about that a lot, but also the people that we need to turn out to vote. One of my favorite statistics is, I think 73%, like if you look at people who didn't vote in 2016, but would have voted for Clinton if they did vote. Only about 23% of those people identify as liberals. The rest identify as moderate or conservative. And, we've seen this in RCTs that we've done where, and one of the first, races we worked on after Trump was the Doug Jones race. And, we built this, not me, but, a large IE group built this whole voter mobilization program for African-Americans that, hit a lot of these cultural touch points, these liberal cultural touch points, like attacking Roy Moore for being racist, for being sexist, for, being a rubber stamp on Donald Trump. And we found that stuff decreased turnout. We found that actually, talking to Black voters about making college more, about how Doug Jones wants to make college more affordable, about how Senate Democrats have plans to get you to, create new jobs, in the South. All of that stuff was effective. And this is really a fight I've had to, and also I'm just gonna really briefly, there's the polling is broken 2018. If you do this correlation with state error, if you look at 2018 error by state versus 2016, it's very, very close. Nate Cohn had an article about this, but sorry, that was derailed. But sorry, what was I saying right before that?
I was monitoring the chat. I believe you were talking about how people of color, the way that they the opinions they have.
Oh yeah. Sorry. Been talking for a long time. So the last anecdote is, this is just something I've had to deal with again and again, working in progressive politics, starting with the Obama campaign, where, there were a group of people in the Obama campaign, and I've seen this really throughout, where they said, oh, we want to increase our vote share with the Hispanic vote. So let's talk about immigration. We need to send immigration mailers to Hispanics. And, I think this attitude of let's talk to Hispanic people about immigration, let's talk to Black people about policing, let's talk to women about abortion. It's racist. It's actually, but worse, just as bad as that. I don't know. Also bad is that it doesn't work. We actually went and we did an RCT where we tested, different kinds of messaging. And, what came out was that actually Hispanic voters want to hear about schools and the economy, and not immigration. So, I think that the actual audience for racial justice messaging, that's a broad term. I'm not saying people should ever talk about racial justice, but I think the desire to frame race neutral policies via racial justice lens, the audience for that isn't actually non-white voters. And I think the CALA results made that very clear, that non-white voters also showed a preference for economic language. It's, very liberal people who work in politics. And I think that, it'd be an interesting trade-off if non-white voter, if it was what non-white voters wanted. But I don't think we should lose elections because of the aesthetic preferences of people who decide to work in progressive politics.
All right. This one is from Ocelot. By the way, if you have to leave soon.
No, I don't have any. It's 9 p.m. here. I'm chilling.
Okay.
I'll walk off and grab a drink in a sec. But yeah, I'm here.
This one is from Ocelot. I'm going to make some addendums to it, but I like the question. It's, have you seen any polling on YIMBY-ish policies? For the sake of this question, let's say zoning reform, housing abundance, and a reduced reliance on cars. And do you have any insight onto whether those are popular or politically viable or not?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Nate Cohn did some of the, I think, highest quality polling on this. I really admire, Nate Cohn's polling. It was like everyone's polling, too optimistic this cycle. But I think that the way he does issue polling, I think he approaches it with like a healthy skepticism, which I admire. But then I think he does a good job of writing questions in a way that don't generate liberal propaganda. And so he threw it on some of his 2020 polls. I believe he had polling questions about the duplex or triplex co-option thing. I'm not a housing policy expert, but I think Minnesota passed like something, some kind of YIMBY-ish bill, or it was being debated.
Yeah, they made it so they got rid of single family zoning. And
that was Oregon, maybe Minnesota did too. But so either way, yeah. Nate Cohn did some polling on this, and what he found was that, generally speaking, loosening zoning restrictions is popular in the general electorate. And so it is like an interesting, like I think, and I haven't done a ton of polling on this, but I do think that within reason, there are upzoning policies that have support among the general public. The big problem is that it's quite, I mean, I have to look at the crosstabs, but my guess is it's quite correlated with age. It's quite correlated with race, where non-white voters, I think, have more liberal attitudes on this than white voters do. And that means, and the people who actually show up to these zoning, someone actually did a study showing that the people who show up to these zoning meetings are like, wildly disproportionate in this respect. And so it's a real challenge because unfortunately, and I'm again, not an expert on this, but like a very large fraction of zoning decisions are made at these like hyper local or local levels where the electorate is substantially older and richer and more likely to own property than the overall population. And that makes building a coalition around renters harder. That's why I think some of the state level policy that people have been doing shows so much promise, that like the kind of backlash that very legitimately can occur if you're a mayor, it's a lot less likely to happen if you're a governor, because turnout is just so much higher. It's a completely different electorate, in that regard. So I think, I think that's part of the story. I think that the YIMBYs have done a really good job. I used to be more skeptical, but I think they've done a really good job of getting elite support. This is a movement that in a lot of ways didn't exist 10 years ago. And now there are large YIMBY components in the infrastructure bill. So, I can't, normally I can criticize what activists do, but I think so far they're doing a good job.
All right. This one is from Jeremy, and it's what is wrong with gun control polling? So it seems like it will poll well as an issue, but when voters are asked to vote on it in a referendum, or I guess if the legislators want to pass it, support seems to collapse.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and there's like a couple of different ways that you can look at this. But first, just to make clear that there is a problem. That's the first step. So how do we know there's a problem? If you go and you look at ballot measure polling for, say, background checks, there are all these polls, and I actually, Congressman Ted Lieu was mad at me about this, which was, and sorry, I'm just gonna change rooms. But Congressman Ted Lieu actually, tweeted at me about this. But people, all the polls point to this idea that gun control is this incredibly popular issue. But then when it shows up on the ballot, like there was a ballot measure in Maine, actually, in 2018, I believe, where it actually lost. Background checks lost on the ballot. And so how do you reconcile the polling where background checks sometimes polls at 90% or more with this like lived reality that this lived reality that background checks fail when you actually put them on the ballot. And so there's a couple of moving pieces. And hold on. There's a couple of moving pieces that get you there. The first is this thing of trust that I talked about a little bit before. There's this great ballot measure. There's this great thing that Gallup does on trust on different issues. If you like Google Gallup, the link is like different parties have different strengths, or parties see, voters see parties having their own strengths. And let me just turn this light off. What you see there is that people trust Republicans on guns, and I've mentioned previously they trust Republicans on immigration and crime. They also trust Republicans on guns. And so when it actually came up to the ballot, this background checks bill, like voters might initially say, I support there being background checks, but then when the policy debate actually happens, there are like all of these little details. So, one example is if you want to ban background check, if you want to have universal background checks, what that really means, given that individuals are not allowed to do background checks of other people, is that you're really banning private gun sales. That's what that's the whole reason why there's a loophole in the first place. And so what that means is you can say, oh, well, should it be legal for someone to sell, pass down a gun to their son without background checks? And then maybe you write that exception in. Then they go, oh, what about your friend? And like all these policy details happen, and people will advocate in favor of the party they trust more. And the reality is that people do trust Republicans more on guns because guns are seen as a kind of an extension of public safety. That's one piece. I think the other piece is just this reality that issue polling in general is super biased. There's something called acquiescence bias, which is just if you ask voters, do you support a thing? Yes, just has a high, has a bias, and there's like reasons for this that are technical and interesting. But there's a rule in ballot measure polling that unless you're polling at 60%, you're probably going to lose. Generally speaking, ballot measure polling overperforms the result by something like 10 points. And so, those are the two big factors. I'll stop there.
Yeah. I also imagine if you're the type of person to say other people aren't to be trusted, you're more likely to own a gun.
Well, yeah, I mean, oh, and there's one other point that's important with that, which is, gun control. I actually think, Maine is more rural than the country overall. Like my guess is that gun control is like above, like if you polled it in the proper way, it's like probably above 50 nationwide. But the problem with guns is that it's highly correlated with education. Working class white people are substantially more likely to be opposed to gun control. And so from the perspective of winning the Electoral College or winning the Senate, which very heavily overweights the views of working class voters, you can't do it. We need to win. Unfortunately, rural white voters are just worth more in our electoral system. And that means that, we have to cater to them in some way. And yes, Joe found the link. That is the one.
Okay, I'm going to combine a couple questions here, but essentially there's been a lot of people asking just what is going on with education attainment polarization? Like what is I guess what's the story there? Is it that college is making people more likely to vote for Democrats, or is there some sort of selection bias going on or something like that?
So, I do believe it's hard to show these things conclusively. I do believe the link between education and liberalism is causal. There's some, I think, pretty plausible, quasi-experimental evidence where, my favorite study, but there are others too, looks at, minimum age, minimum years of schooling required, that a bunch of European countries changed minimum years of schooling from like 12 to 16 or 16 to 18 at different points. And so you can basically use that as an instrument or an RDD to compare people just before the cutoff, just before, because they ended up getting more schooling. And what you could see is that more schooling increases support for cosmopolitan attitudes. Like that paper looked at support for immigration, going from an extra 2 years of schooling before you're 18, I think translated to like 5 or 6% support for lower immigration. And that's I think it's probably mostly real, but I think the real story with education polarization that I like to tell is that, education levels are just much higher than they used to be. I think this is one of the most underrated demographic trends, of Western politics, is that if you go immediately after World War II, less than 5% of the electorate had gone to college. 80% of the public had not graduated from high school. And you go to now, less than high school is like 5%, or white less than high school is like 5% of the electorate. It basically doesn't exist anymore. It's disproportionately immigrants. And about almost 40% of the electorate has a college degree. And so there's just been this massive change, and it's still going. The electorate is getting about 1% more educated every year, which is crazy. It's a very rapid. Demographic changes. That's really wild. And I think that college-educated people, for whatever reason, whether it's causal or not, have really different values than non-college voters. And that's true here, it's true in South Africa, it's true everywhere, in terms of college educated voters having much more liberal views on immigration, much more liberal views on taking in refugees, and other cosmopolitan issues. And they also have totally different values on race, totally different values on gender, totally different visions for what kind of neighborhoods they want to live in and all of that. And so, the story I'd like to tell is that immediately after World War II, most of the country was not educated, didn't have a college degree. But at that time, 80% of people in the Senate, had college degrees. And, the country was still run by highly cosmopolitan Ivy League grads, on both the left and the right. And so there was this kind of ideological cartel that was also enforced by a media cartel, since the media was so concentrated, that basically made politics about the disagreements on economic policy or foreign policy that existed between the highly educated people on the left and highly educated people on the right. And both sides knew that if they tried to campaign on, social liberalism or cosmopolitanism, that they would lose. And, we know this because McGovern tried. He ran a 2016 Clinton election, but with 1972 demographics, and he got clobbered. But I think what happened was in some ways it's unsurprising that as the college educated share goes from 5% to 40%, that the salience of this difference between college educated voters and non-college voters is going to increase. And that's really bad. I think it's very bad that this is happening because it turns out that, college, SES, latent SES is correlated with a lot of things that, are good, faith in democracy, skepticism of authoritarianism, racial resentment, a lot of things. And I think that American democracy being kind of disproportionately run by, if you had a world where both the left and the right had these highly cosmopolitan values, then those values aren't really up for debate. But if one party has all the people who aren't authoritarian and the other party has all the people who are authoritarian, the authoritarians are going to win half the time, and we might not get another, then there might not be another election. So I think it's all very concerning. And, I think from we have an existential, duty to do what we can to try to depolarize things on education lines.
Well, speaking of things we can do, this one's from John. It says, are there any ways for data scientists or other technologists to make impactful contributions in their free time to political or policy campaign efforts? And then I'm candidly, I'm not a technical person, but he also asks if there's any GitHub repos or something. I'm not sure what that means.
Yeah, I mean, I've personally found it very rewarding to volunteer for campaigns. I volunteered for a lot of local campaigns while I lived in Chicago for 7 years, and I volunteered in a lot of local campaigns there and found it very rewarding doing data work. Tech for Campaigns is a great organization that I think does some really cool volunteer work. But I'll say that actually, the real answer I'll give is I think that people who, this group of people, tech workers who are interested in policy, you're all actually overwhelmingly educated. You have a lot of disproportionate social proximity to power and, all these other things. And so I would say that really the biggest impact that you can have, and there's good experimental evidence on this, is to just post. Posting is praxis, is what I like to tease my leftists on. Is that if you're a good writer and you just go out there and you try to make points for your viewpoints, you can actually do a lot. I think the neoliberal movement. If you look at what they are and what they've accomplished, in terms of moving the public conversation in the last 3 years, I think that dwarfs, realistically what you can get as doing some DBA work for a local campaign. You should do the latter. I've done it. I found it very rewarding. But I think that, just going out and talking to your social network and talking on social media in a productive way and a well-written way about things you care about, it's a super impactful thing. And, you know, doing stuff like this, creating networks of people who can support each other, you know, doing things like, running for office and all that. Like, it's all just, I mean, it sounds corny, but it's all actually super important. It's one of the only drivers of social progress, one way or the other.
Okay, I got two more questions, and then I think we can call it a night. First question here is, this one's for me, actually. So I just wanted your opinion on just the name neoliberal for what our group is, because it seems almost as if you're shooting yourself in the foot right away, because that's not a very popular term among most people. But at the same time, it's a really good attention grabbing term, because people will say, wait, these guys are calling themselves neoliberals. I need to engage with them and express my anger. So I was wondering if you had an opinion on that.
Yeah, I think this gets to one of the core challenges in activism, which is, I can do message testing and say that Democrats should talk about healthcare. And, Chuck Schumer is out there every single day, bless his soul, talking about healthcare, talking about gasoline prices or whatever. And the media just doesn't cover it. The reality is, if you, unless the media covers, or unless you affect the discourse, you're not changing anything. And so I think that there's interesting second order strategies. Like, Bernie Sanders, for example, I think he was probably a little less electable than Biden, though not by very much. And I think he really outperformed how electable he was given his ideology. And, I think one of the reasons was that by adopting the socialism label, which, to be clear, is a politically toxic label, even though I identify as a socialist, he was able to attract tons of attention. He was able to talk about economic issues and complain about millionaires and billionaires and get covered. While, if Joe Biden did, he wouldn't get covered. And I think another thing was that he was able to provoke his opponents. When Republicans saw him, they got really angry, and they just started blabbing to every reporter who would hear, no, people don't deserve healthcare. Taxes should be, taxes are theft, whatever. And so I think that there's something to that, and that just gets to this real trade-off where you can get a lot of attention by acid coding. I like to call it acid coding. But then, at some point you have to figure out how to repackage your ideas in a way that's palatable. And so what you really kind of have to do, the real challenge is how can you build your community using, exciting language, while also making sure that the public isn't hearing that isn't your message to the public. So, I would say, it's probably, you can't change your name now. And I think in this particular case, I don't think the median American voter knows what neoliberalism is. So, I think you're probably okay there. It's also probably, I think that in some ways, by calling yourself neoliberal, you make your policies seem a lot more moderate than they are. I think it's very strange in some ways that, you all decided to reclaim a term that was originally reserved for, charging money for water supplies in Latin America and cutting healthcare, to instead be a standard bearer for, like, European social democracy. It's like a bit of a weird choice. But the flip side is, I think that you have successfully, it's not just you, but I think that there has been a successful rebranding of the center, that apparently, that policies that I supported as a socialist in 2012 are now, considered to be moderate. And I do think, I do think that, some of the branding decisions you've made, probably were part of it. So I don't want to criticize you all. You've all, it's very hard to build a movement from nothing. And I think that you've all had an amazing impact. So I don't want to criticize you too much.
No, that's fair. Really, I wasn't one of the founding people on this, but it was interestingly, the name came before everything else. Yeah, where it was just the name there, and then all the policies sprouted from there. And it, I don't think Margaret Thatcher would like us a lot. Okay, final question. This one is from Joe. What book do you recommend we all read?
That's a good question. People mentioned Eitan Hirsch's book, and I think that is a good suggestion. I feel bad in that in practice, I don't actually read that many books. So that reflects poorly on me as a person. But I think, the influential thing for understanding public opinion is John Zoller's The Origins of Mass Opinion. It's kind of pretty seminal work. I would say Han Noel has a book about, I think it's called Coalition Merchants or something like that, that is supposed to be very good. But to be honest, like I mainly get my stuff. I think that we've learned a lot about political science. Like I have a ton of admiration for the academic political science community, or at least a big part of it, in the last 4 years, for the basic reason that surveys, due to the rise of online polling, are a lot cheaper, than they've ever been. And so, I would say that I really like reading Matt Grossman. He's on Twitter. He's a political scientist. He does a lot of tweet storms, showing, some of the interesting academic work that's getting done in political science. I'm also a big fan of Alexander Berger and Otis Reed and Jonathan Robinson. They all also, I think, have very smart and interesting things to say about, about public opinion in the literature. Highly recommend reading all of them. I think that gets you a lot of the way there.
Okay, well, that's going to do it for us. Thank you again for coming out, everybody. Thank you for coming, David, and have a good night.
Thank you so much. Take care.